Anyone who has ever been to Europe knows that people just seem to enjoy life there far more than we Americans seem to enjoy our lives here. It is not uncommon to see people outside with a glass of wine, a scrumptious looking croissant, a book and cigarette in hand, or an attractive guy or girl in tow. What is it about those Europeans? Today, I'm very excited to speak with someone who writes on this very subject, how we can find our joie de vivre in our everyday lives, even if we don't live in Paris. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, and welcome to Timeless and the Julie Hartman YouTube channel in general. You can catch Dennis and Julie, my show with Dennis Prager, on this channel every Monday at 1 o'clock Pacific and 4 o'clock Eastern. And then Timeless is Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at that same time, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. And of course, you can listen to these if you care not to see my face on YouTube. You can download them on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Kathy Yandel is a professor of French and Francophone studies at Carleton College. She has authored, edited, or co-edited several books, including ones on early modern France and the Renaissance. Her most recent book is The French Art of Living Well, Finding Joie de Vivre in the Everyday World. And she is coming to us today all the way from Paris. Well, to clarify, she's not in the studio, but she is here on Zoom, and we are very grateful to have her here in any capacity. Hi, Professor Yandel. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Julie, and you can call me Kathy.
Oh, well, thank you. You heard before we were filming that my producer and I got into a bit of a fight about the way that I was pronouncing joie de vivre. Now, I know that it's incorrect. He thinks that it's egregiously incorrect. Can you please, in your gorgeous French accent, tell us the proper way to say it?
Joie de vivre.
Yes. So for the audience, when Professor Yandel was trying to teach me how to say it before the introduction, I just said, my language doesn't work that way. I would rather butcher it and then be corrected than attempt to say it that way and butcher it even further. But that's why we have you here, among other reasons, to say these gorgeous French words. By the way, here in my notes, I have all of these words that I learned from you, including s'attarder, which is the verb which means in French to linger or to pause over. And I have the phonetic way of saying it in all caps. So I have a little cheat sheet. So to begin, before we go into the specifics of your book, tell me how you got interested in French and Francophone studies. Are you French?
Not at all. I grew up in New Mexico, unbelievably, right off of the Navajo reservation where my parents were teachers. And I heard all these different languages around me, Spanish and Hopi and Zuni, and of course Navajo. But I had never heard French. And just to make it brief, our family was housing a visiting singer who was part of a choir from Belgium. And she asked me if we could sing, if I happened to know Frère Jacques. And my mother had taught it to me as Frère Jacques. And there was this one verse which we sang as Sama la Matina. And when she asked me if we could sing it as a round, I said, of course, I'd love to do that. And we began singing, and I heard her say, Sonnez les matines. And I thought, that has nothing to do with the way I learned it. And I just fell in love with French at that very moment when I was about 7 years old, never having heard it. And later ended up majoring in it and coming to live in France for about 10 years of my life, and the rest is history.
So did you start taking courses in French once you were 7 years old, or did that come later?
No, there was no way to do that. And so it didn't come back until I was 14. And then I was able to take it in high school.
Wow.
For the first time.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college at the University of New Mexico, and then to do my doctorate at Berkeley.
Okay. And then from there, how did you further your career in this field? Did you major in French?
Right, and went on to get a PhD And then I'm teaching at Carleton College, which is a wonderful liberal arts college in Minnesota.
Yes, I want to ask you at the end a bit about Carleton College, because it seems to me to be kind of the image that many people have of the idyllic liberal arts college, and I want to know what the secret is, or if you seem to agree with that. But we can get to that at the end, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to discuss your fantastic book. As I told you, it came to me at the recommendation of a friend who is studying abroad right now in Paris. And she was so taken with it that she sent it to me because she thought that I could really use it in my own life. And in addition to that, I also thought it would be a great show topic. So can you please describe for the audience what the basis of your book is? I mean, it's pretty well synopsized in the title, but why did you write it, and what is it generally about?
Well, I decided to teach a course once called La Joie de Vivre, about a lot of French and Francophone literature that concentrates on that, or that somehow deals with the subject. And it struck me during that time that there's really no straight English translation for joie de vivre. It means literally joy of living, but there's a whole sort of image encapsulated in that expression. And in fact, English can't seem to translate it because it's now part of Webster's dictionary, joie de vivre. And I thought, why is that the case? And that sent me sort of thinking about what it is about French culture that brings this kind of joy, and even in their daily lives. And I got an invitation from St. Martin's Press to write about this and jumped at the occasion.
What is it then about the French that allows them to, I mean, this is the basis of the whole episode, and I'll ask more specific questions about some of the things that I learned from your book that I think are indicators, but just in general terms, why do you think there is such a word in French and not in English?
Well, I think the French have captured some of that magic that comes from really benefiting from the present moment. There are two things, well, many more than two things, but two of the major things that I insist on in the book are the body and the sort of relationship to the body that the French seem to have, and with all sorts of sensory experiences. And the other is the French relationship to time, and how they consider time both in terms of the importance for its history, but also time as the present moment, and how you can make that moment last, rather than thinking so linearly about what's happening tomorrow and what's happening 5 years from now, and making a 5-year plan. Which is not to say they never do that.
Right.
But which is to say that the emphasis is much more on, say, spending time with people. And I always think of this example that some of our French students who come to study from France say, and that is that they'll go to an American party and they'll talk with someone for a long time, and then they'll see that person, they'll feel really close to them, they'll share stories and spend the whole evening together, and then they'll see them on campus again, and the person will just say hi and walk on. And the French people are very surprised by that, because French people tend to weave these sort of tapestries of friendship that once you start them, they're sort of expected to continue. And so a lot of that has to do with time too, and taking the time to stop as you're walking across campus and maybe talk to somebody, instead of always being in a hurry as we Americans tend to do.
That is a very interesting observation. As someone who recently graduated from college, I concur that you'll be at a party and have a conversation with someone and feel a connection, and then the next day you see them and it is as if it didn't happen. And frankly, I always thought, well, maybe we had too much to drink at that party and that person doesn't remember having a conversation with me, and perhaps certainly in the college environment that may be the case. But I think that you're hitting on something important here where and correct me, please, of course, if you think I'm mischaracterizing it and I can't quite put my finger on it, but maybe I think you're totally right about time and taking the time to really get to know someone and have that interaction be meaningful. But also, there seems to me to be this element of being genuine that maybe the French have better mastered than Americans. Because really, what it is if you have a conversation with someone and then the next day they basically act as if it never happened and they didn't know you, that indicates that there was a level of disingenuousness in that exchange. So do you think that authenticity and a sense of being genuine is a ingredient alongside this emphasis on taking time that the French seem to master and appreciate?
That's an interesting point. I'm not sure about authenticity, but I think that definitely conversations are more meaningful to French people. And part of that is that the conversations strike me very quickly as going pretty deep. They might not be personal. When I say deep, I don't mean necessarily that they're going to tell you their whole life story right away, but they tend to be deep very quickly, maybe even concerning some cultural thing that's happening. Certainly politics, but that's a really interesting question about authenticity. I do think that the conversations tend to go deeper, and that invites more of a friendship developing than sometimes our more flighty or quick conversations.
I was just in London for a conference about 2 weeks ago, and I met so many fascinating people from all over the world, but I really spent a lot of time with Brits because I was there for about a week. And I went out with some of my friends who live there, got to know their friends, got to meet many British people at this conference. And I say this knowing that probably some of them are listening, and I mean no disrespect. Sincerely, I don't. But I found as an American that it was a bit difficult to connect with British people at the first conversation or the second conversation, even the third conversation. It doesn't mean I didn't get there, but certainly at the beginning, I felt like they were always kind of 5 feet away from me. And I actually mean that as a compliment to them, in part because I really appreciate the polite and deferential and reserved element of British culture that we Americans seem to not have. We're very impolite compared to the Brits, but also we can be seen as very friendly compared to the Brits. And so anyway, I just wanted to offer that as a comparison, because I found again that there was a little bit of a distance in some of my conversations with them. But then you're saying here that with French people in general, they seem to go deep really quickly. And I know that depth is different from friendliness, but how do you think all of these kind of compare to one another?
Well, it's interesting. I do think both French and English or British are reserved compared to Americans, for sure. But I mentioned the story in my book of politeness in France, and that's really taught from such an early age. You'll hear mothers or fathers in the metro saying to their children, "No, now don't talk so loudly because there are other people here." And they're taught from the very beginning the whole importance of being around other people. So that politeness maybe comes across sometimes as distance, but the little story I tell in my book is that with my French brother once, I walked into a store and was having a really nice conversation with the saleswoman, and everything went quite beautifully. And then we left the little store, and he said to me in French, of course, "Tu n'es pas très poli, Cathy. You're not very polite." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you didn't say bonjour and you didn't say au revoir." And
Wow.
once I went up to a guy, not remembering this, at a bus stop and said, "Excuse me," in my most polite conditional tense, "would you be able to tell me when the next bus, et cetera, et cetera?" And he looked very stern and he said, "Bonjour." And so I said, "Oh, yeah, that's right. Bonjour." And then I asked my question, and then he was very, very nice. But I do think there's a warmth in French society that you get to pretty quickly, that it takes a lot longer to get to in British society. I think you're absolutely right on that.
That's interesting that there is an emphasis on politeness, that this man needed you to say bonjour. And I know, Sean, you're laughing at me, my producer. I know I butchered that in my American accent. I can't say it as eloquently and beautifully as Professor Yandel, but it was sort of, it seems to me like you needed to establish that politeness. You needed to get over that barrier. You needed to demonstrate that deference to him. And then he was willing to be very warm with you.
Exactly.
That's probably the word of the episode. Interesting. I've realized I've said it many times, but why do you think that is? And let's compare that to the United States. There would be no such interaction in the United States. Why?
Right. So I think it's because we're very pragmatic and we want to get to the point. And that's why it struck me. I'm standing right in front of this person at the bus stop. I don't need to say bonjour. He knows I'm there. I
Right.
know he's there. So my American sense says, well, let's get to business. Let's just get this done. And the French sense would be, there's another human being here. I have to acknowledge this human being as a human being and not simply as the source of my question for my own information. And so it seems to me that the same is true if you go into a store, that the person isn't just standing there to wait on you. The person is first and foremost a person that you acknowledge. So I do think it has to do with training. I mean, you will hear French parents very often explaining to their children why they cannot do this, why they cannot do that, in cafes, in restaurants, in the public transportation, in ways that you don't hear them do in the United States, or at least not as frequently.
How nice. That is really nice.
Really?
Yes, I envy that. So you're a historian, obviously. Where do you think this comes from? The transactional, and again, of course, we're speaking in broad terms, but these themes seem to really resonate. Why do you think that Americans in general have a more transactional culture, whereas in France they really, as you are saying, tend to see you first as a person, as opposed to first as the person from whom you can get information or a favor or a service? Are there any historical roots or perhaps causes that you could identify?
Well, we could start with Benjamin Franklin's statement, very famous statement that time is money. I think the French imagine the Americans to think only of money. That's certainly far from the case, but I don't think we ask people their salaries that much in the US, but we certainly want to know about them. And that would be the last thing on a French person's mind. That's just not something you talk about. So I think that a lot of the sort of business-oriented aspect of the United States has prevailed. And that's not to say that there's not something of a business culture in France, but it hasn't permeated the entire society of getting things done, right? It's more, I mean, I talk about this also in the book. There's a French law that says that you can't eat lunch at your desk. Why can't you eat lunch at your desk? Well, the idea is that as a worker, you need to get away. You need to have a little break during the day. You don't want to be an automaton, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with our getting things done. And frankly, as an American, sometimes when I'm waiting in a line here in France, I think, oh my gosh, this could be so much more efficient.
Yes. It seems to me from our conversation and from what I've observed, having gone to France myself, that they seem to be totally engaged, giving you their undivided, devoted attention to any conversation or any task that they are in. Obviously, in America, we are kind of out to lunch mentally. Sometimes if we're talking with people, we're thinking about that thing that we need to do at work. We'll eat lunch at our desks. We'll have our AirPods in. We'll be talking with someone on the phone as we're picking up a prescription. And again, there seems to be this kind of take every moment and every person and interaction in France for what it is, instead of thinking about it as a launch pad or a checklist that you have to tick off.
Right. I think it comes back to time too. How do we
Yes.
imagine time? And, there's such an emphasis on the senses here in France. I mean, just recently, I went to a restaurant. It was for a celebration, and it recently got a 1 star in the Michelin, and it's by a Malian origin cook. He's actually born in France but has Malian parents, and his restaurant has fusion Japanese, French, and Malian cooking, and it just took off. It's one of the fastest Michelin stars in history. And the reason I cite that is that there's obviously a big emphasis on food and taking time for the sort of sensory pleasures of food and exchange. And to come back to your point, conversations while you're doing that, which is why meals take such a long time in
Yes.
France.
Yes. To harken back to the history question, I recently read a fantastic book that I recommend to everyone by Tim Marshall called Prisoners of Geography. And it's sort of a similar book as Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he takes, I think there are 10 chapters or 10 countries that he profiles, and he discusses how the geography of that country has informed the culture, the migration patterns, the economic state, the extent to which that country has had to deal with invasions or wars, etc. And perhaps because I'm an American, I sort of reject or find myself having a kind of Pavlovian allergy to the idea that geography determines a nation, or there are these outside factors that determine a nation. I like to think that no, what you make of yourself, what the populace makes of itself, that determines a nation. But by the time that I was done with Tim Marshall's book, I found myself reconsidering my understanding that again, these factors, weather, geography, the proximity to the ocean, et cetera, does have a large effect on the country. He did not have a chapter on France. What are there any elements of France's I know it sounds maybe odd to the American ear, but are there any elements of French geography or climate or proximity to other cultures or some of these kind of external factors that might affect this joie de vivre that we're describing?
That's really an interesting question. I have never thought about, but I will say that, if you figure that France is about the same size as Texas,
Mm-hmm.
but geographically it has dramatically different areas. So that you have the Alps and you have the Mediterranean oceans, and you have the Jura, which is a mountain range in the center of France, and you have lots of agricultural country. You have some more arid regions, like in Provence, where you have a lot of sand. So diversity is the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about French geography. But I think you said something really important about you think, and I think, as an American, well, surely that can't be true because we define ourselves in
Right.
some way. I do think that French culture is trained, and this is historically true, to think of themselves more as a culture and more as members of a community necessarily than
Mm.
the sort of make it yourself individuals, if that makes any sense.
It does. I'll give you another example of something that I'm getting at. I visited Israel 2 years ago, and one of the things that I was most surprised to take away from that trip was the spirit of the Israeli people. I was so blown away by their sense of vitality and it was a trip that was led by Israelis, and we met a ton. Obviously our tour guides were Israelis, but we really got to spend time with Israelis all over the country. And I was so impressed with their again, their spirit. They had this ability to be very deep and very direct and acknowledge and talk about very sad things, very complicated things. And then we'd go out at night, and they were like the biggest partiers who I've ever encountered in the best way. They had so much fun. And at every single dinner, they would raise their glass and go, L'chaim, to life. And that's when I realized, when I heard that toast, when they were saying L'chaim, it kind of all made sense to me. I thought, wow, Americans are kind of deadened in comparison, again, speaking in broad terms, because we have not had to confront life and the possibility of losing life as much as Israelis have. Obviously, almost all Israelis, some get exemptions, but almost all of them have to serve in the IDF. Many have, especially now after October 7th, many have friends and family members who have died in terrorist attacks and wars. And there just, again, seems to be this understanding, because of their history, because of their culture and their environment, that life is a precious thing that we ought to celebrate and kind of feel in all of its capacities, both the sad and the happy. And so again, I'm sorry to kind of hammer this point home, but I just wanted to make it clear what I'm getting at, that I think there are elements of, again, geography, climate, history, government, requirements in the case of Israel serving the IDF that kind of serve to inform a culture or a personality of a place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think France obviously doesn't have the same history as
Right,
Israel,
of course.
and is not really fighting for its life, although it historically, in the 1870 war, it lost Alsace to, the Prussian Empire, to Germany. And there have been many sort of strifes in France over the years, from wars with England to the civil wars in the 16th century between the Protestants and the Catholics, not to mention the Second World War, where French people themselves were in some ways collaborating to send Jews out, but many of the others were doing quite the opposite as resistors. And so I think that, France really does have a sense of itself as, as a country, as a people, as a culture. And I think many of the immigrants are actually enriching the culture too, in ways that I've just cited, like the restaurant, but many other people. The baguette contest has been won for the 4 of the last 6 years by immigrants. So I think although France has really fought for its own existence as a people, it also is incorporating people from other cultures who now live here.
I'd like to ask you about the hereditary class system in France, in the extent to which you think that informs their enjoyment or their view of life. As bizarre as this may sound to American ears, and maybe I'm totally off on this, it seems almost to be to their benefit that the class system is more ingrained in French culture than it is in American culture, because many French people have to remain in the geographic area where they were born, and they kind of remain in the economic and social class to which they were born. Perhaps they feel more free to enjoy the simple pleasures that their circumstances have blessed them with. Am I off on that, or is there some truth to it?
I think there's probably some historical truth. I think that that's changing a lot. I mean, I have a friend who has a de in her name, which used to be, a noble, so-and-so de so-and-so.
Mm-hmm.
And she says that that's actually sometimes not a positive thing, that it's not well accepted in society necessarily. So that's one example. One could furnish, I'm sure, counterexamples, but certainly as in the US, as in, New York, where there still exists some kind of system like that of the debutante balls or whatever, they're just so much less prevalent than they used to be. And it seems to me that that's also the case in France. But one of the things that I do love about French culture is that a lot of a lot of it is trying to preserve the beauty of the French language, say,
Mm.
so that I have a friend who teaches French to people who've just arrived and who are even going to soup kitchens, say. So I do think that there's this unifying factor, which is the French language, which now is spoken, as you know, in quite a few countries around the world.
Yes, you have a young man. Young man is actually an understatement. He's 4 years old, who you discuss in your book Henri, and you talk about the fact how that he spoke perfect French at age 4. And that was mind blowing to me. How could a 4-year-old speak perfect French? But it speaks to the observation that you just made, that there seems to be this emphasis on preserving the beauty and teaching the beauty at a very young age of the French language. And boy, how beautiful it is.
Well, I'm sure he had a lot of vocabulary to learn, but when I first arrived in Paris and I had been studying French for 4 years, I thought, how fair is that? Because his French is perfect and mine
Right.
just has so far to go.
Oh, well, yours now sounds pristine, especially compared to mine. Before we continue with Professor Yandel, I'd like to quickly tell you about My Pillow. I use many My Pillow products. I walk into work every day wearing my slippers because they're so comfortable, and then during the last minute, I change into heels. I sleep on My Pillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets, and I use the My Towels. And you can get many of these products at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you'll receive 60% off of the Giza Dream sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll receive a set for as low as $39.99 with the promo code Hartman. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745, and you guessed it, use the promo code Hartman. Along with this offer, you'll get deep discounts on all My Pillow products, including the My Pillow mattress topper, the aforementioned My Pillow towel sets, and more. So speaking of Henri, there's another character that you have in your book, and I'm making it sound like a fiction book. It's not a fiction book. This is someone who you actually encountered during your time in France. And this was the woman who returned your wallet to you. Professor Yandel, if I'm remembering correctly, you were with your toddler and you went to the grocery store and somehow you lost your wallet. And there was a woman who was kind enough to return it to you. But there was a little bit of a caveat. She said,
Right.
when she returned the wallet to you, well, aren't you going to give me something for it? And you ended up paying her, I believe it was 100 francs. Is that right?
Yes, which was about $20 at the time.
Yes, $20 at the time. But still, that interaction.
That's all I had.
Yes, that was all that you had in your wallet. That interaction was so interesting for me. One of the things I love about your book is that you talk about these little exchanges, and they say so much about, and of course that's the point, they say so much about the greater culture. First of all, thank God the woman returned it to you. In the United States, a lot of people would just pocket your wallet and never return it. But I admired, but I both admired and was also kind of taken aback as an American by her chutzpah, her saying to you, well, you better repay me for my returning the wallet to you. In the United States, as I said, most people would probably just take the wallet, or they would take out the money and then return the wallet, or they would just, out of the graciousness and goodness of their own heart, just give you the wallet without expecting anything in return. But clearly things are different in France. What does that interaction reveal about French culture?
Well, I think first of all that was a long time ago because my daughter, that particular daughter, is not a toddler at all. I do think that there was a sort of old school of you find something, you get a reward, and that exists probably in some places in the US as well. But I think it was just a sense of justice, she thought, rather than a sense of generosity. But I have many counterexamples of French people who've also found things and just turned them in and so on. But that particular encounter was particularly funny to me just because I had never thought of it in that way. But I think it was, I have done something, now you might do something in return. She didn't demand it, she
Right.
just asked. Yeah.
Well, again, and I observed this when I was in Paris. There's just a straightforwardness that that again is both sort of difficult as an American to understand and seems kind of abrasive to an American, but it's also very refreshing. As with the man who demanded that you say bonjour before you ask your
Right.
question, it was like, here's what I want of you, and once you provide it, then I'll be very warm to you. And again, there's something very refreshing about that. And you think, as an American, you think that that person doesn't like you. You think when they're admonishing you or when they're asking you to do something, they're somehow insulting you, or it somehow means that they don't take kindly to you. But no, they just are kind of laying down the law, making it clear that they have self-respect, what they expect out of you, and then once that's fulfilled, it's in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, that's something I think we can learn from
Yes.
French people, is not to take things so personally. I always think of the example of when an American friend came to France to visit, and she and somebody named Jacques, who's a friend of the family, and I all went out to have coffee, and we got into this huge discussion about different religious traditions, not not having to do with personal selves at all, but the sort of violence that had been present in many religious traditions, if not all, in some ways. And at some point, she stopped and she said, "You don't care what I think, do you?" And we were both taken aback because it's just
Mm.
what you were saying about taking that personally. Somehow she thought we were rejecting her personally because we were all discussing and all sort of countering one another. And she just stopped the conversation. And at the end of that, I said, well, that's one thing we could really learn from the French, is not to think that everything is about us, that things can be about ideas or about politeness, as you say, and they don't have to touch our inner being. They can just be something to talk about or debate about or learn from.
Yes. I was actually about to bring up political debates and political polarization. Obviously, it is so bad right now in the United States. And I think in large part because there is this sense, as you just eloquently articulated, that we in the United States take things so personally. When you're having a political debate, it's and there are people, of course, who make ad hominem attacks and say, well, if you believe this, then it means that you're racist, or if you believe this, it means that you're morally defective. But even when someone challenges you, we as Americans take that so hard and so personally, and oh my gosh, they're so mean and they have such animosity towards me. And I find, and I mentioned I was recently at this international conference in London, I would get into debates with people, not just French people, but a lot of people around the world, and they had a way of challenging you in a very sharp, pointed way that to Americans would seem very abrasive, but they didn't mean it that way at all. It actually meant that they really respected you and they were having a great, robust debate with you, and they wanted to push it further and make it the most fruitful, interesting debate and discussion that it could be.
Right, exactly. And I think people teach their children that from a very early age here. Whereas in our family, we'd say, oh, that's an interesting idea when our children would come up with something. And in France, you know, they'll say, well, why do you think that? Well, what made you think that? Well, on the other hand, couldn't you also say, and so they challenge their own children so that their children will learn, well, I don't even know if it's so that they will learn. It's just that that's part of the culture to debate. So even if you just go see a film, oh, I saw this film and I really liked it. Why did you like it? Well, I liked it because of this. Yeah, but didn't you think that this other aspect was somehow
Hmm.
interfering with this first aspect, etc.? So I think from a very young age, kids are taught to debate here and to think for themselves, which probably has to do with the fact that the legal adult age in France is 18 versus 21. I honestly think that children are forced here more quickly to think for themselves.
I want to be respectful of your time. I know that the whole purpose of the discussion is to talk about joie de vivre and how the French appreciate time. So you're probably doing okay, but I am aware that it's late there for you. So I'll wrap it up. But I do have a few just quick questions for you to close. You spoke about immigration, and obviously this is a huge discussion that we may have to get into more at length at another time, and how many immigrants have enriched French culture. I've been reading so much about the Muslim divisions in France. There's been massive Muslim immigration to France as well as to other countries in Europe, and I'm going to butcher these names, and my producer is going to laugh at me accordingly. But I've been reading about Muslim divisions from the native French population in the suburbs of Benlea. Did I say that correctly? And Noyer. Those are two French suburbs. I hope I didn't butcher those too
Neuilly.
terribly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how has Muslim immigration affected the political or the cultural environment in France?
Well, there's a long history of Muslims moving to France, partly because of its colonial past. So there was a big wave um, in the Second World War. Many North Africans came to fight in the Second World War for France,
Mm-hmm.
or stayed there and fought for France. And then after the Algerian War of Liberation in 1962, there was a whole other wave brought here as workers because they were missing men, and so a lot of men were brought over, and then their families later. So there's this long history, and there are many generations of Muslim people here, many of whom don't practice anymore because they've become more and more French. Um, but at the same time, I think definitely there are political issues around that. And I don't know how much this is in the American press, but just today, a first stage of a new immigration bill has been passed by the Senate, and it has to go through the Assemblée Nationale. But like in the US, France can't have, quote, open borders. The US doesn't have open borders right now. But because who has open borders? But there is a bill to make sure that there aren't huge numbers coming in. But as I say, it has a long and successful history of immigration. Starting starting in the mid last century.
How is the reconstruction of Notre Dame going after the terrible fire?
Yeah, I watched that fire, sadly.
Oh,
From my window
oh
and
gosh.
saw, and when you walk by, you just saw people crying of all ages because it's such a central part of French culture. Um, Macron says it'll be finished by the Olympics, so they will be. The
Hmm.
workers will be there, and it's work. A lot of things are happening. So I think it'll probably happen, but it's not been easy. They have every single piece that they're going to put back of the stones that were removed. They're all documented. It's very time consuming, and I think it's going to be beautiful.
And then, of course, I have to ask the question that I teased at the beginning about Carleton College, where you teach. It seems to me, as I said, to be kind of the idyllic campus with happy students and, a small student to faculty ratio. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, what's your secret?
It's a fair assessment. Yeah, I was a product of big universities. I mean, coming straight from Berkeley, And I didn't know what a liberal arts college was. But I was on a tenure track job, I was going to apply elsewhere after 2 years because, for me, it was one of those M states in the middle of the US, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, you know. But I fell in love with the college and the people there. It's a very diverse group of students. We have 20% of students from Minnesota, but also the rest from around the world, around the United States and around the world. We have students from virtually every state every year. And I think that just a small environment where students and professors do things together, they make projects together, it's just, it's been a wonderful experience to teach there.
And finally, what is one piece of advice that you would give to young Americans about how they might be able to find the joie de vivre in their everyday lives? Of course, your whole book is a lovely instruction manual on how to do so. But I know that a lot of Americans would love to try to achieve that, but because we live in such a transactional culture, and elements of our utilitarian mindset are so embedded in our lives. What is one way that you would recommend that we might be able to start combating that and live happier, fuller lives?
Well, in addition to reading the book,
Yes. First and foremost, read the book.
I would say the question of time, taking time to enjoy. Again, the verb profiter in French means to enjoy, not to profit from, which is really telling, I think. It's sort of emblematic of that contrast. But I'd say taking time for other people, listening in a conversation, going deeper, and just appreciating the beauty that's around you, no matter where you are. There are moments of beauty. That would be a start.
Professor Yandell, I'm so grateful for your time. And I know that you said that the night in France is just getting started at 10 o'clock at night, but I do hope that you're able to rest. And thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for your book. I enjoyed it immensely.
Well, thank you. And thanks for inviting me.
As a reminder to everyone, Professor Yandell's book is The French Art of Living, Finding Joie de Vivre. The French Art of Living Well, Finding Joie de Vivre in the Everyday World. I would count it as one of my top 5 favorite books that I have read in the past year, perhaps in my life. So pretty good recommendation, if I do say so myself, coming from me, given how much I read. Thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you again on this program soon, Professor Yandell. And of course, I hope to see all of you soon. Take care.